But I wanted to welcome everyone to the Bretton Woods Committee's 2018 International Council meeting. And whether you've come from the other side of the world and your head, like me, is probably in 3 different time zones still, or perhaps you just came from the neighborhood, we're very thrilled all of you are here to join us in Bali. My name is Randy Rogers. I'm the Bretton Woods Committee's Executive Director, and I'll be moderating a good portion of the program today. Just a couple housekeeping notes. We don't have a break. This format is a little bit more intimate and speedy than some of our prior programs. So if you need to step out, restrooms are on the other side of the wall there. Refreshments are in back. Please do so. We've got a great program planned, and I hate to use any additional minute that the managing director could afford us. So I want to start by thanking Managing Director Lagarde for joining us once again and continuing to share her unrivaled insights with the committee. Of course, thank you to the fund for hosting us once again in their venue, and for the event team's planning for these meetings, and actually this beautiful venue and the vibrant host country and peoples here. They've supplied us with a room with, I think, a lot of positive energy and Balinese taste. So Madam Lagarde will be joined by Masood Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development and also a Bretton Woods Committee member. Masood's leading CGD now after a long career with the international financial institutions. And in the interest of limited time, we'll have 30 minutes, a conversation with Managing Director Lagarde, and we will provide a few minutes near the end to at least get a couple questions in from the audience before she has to excuse herself for one of her many other programs going forward. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Masood.
Thank you very much, Randy. Thank you all for being here on time. We have only half an hour, so I'm not going to take any time to do an introduction or even to add more to what Randy said about the Managing Director. I think the best way to start is to ask Christine Lagarde to sort of give us a little bit her sense. And I guess the only thing I would say to you, Managing Director, on this is that, you know, in the run-up to these meetings, if you see what has been coming out of the fund, if you look at what's out in the media, you listen to Maury's press conference yesterday, so the sort of single word, phrase that sticks out is kind of watch out. You know? So in the sense that the risks are rising, that you begin to see some countries already experiencing problems, you begin to see trade tensions now being called trade war, you see a sense that debt is increasing, and so a lot of a sense of worry. And I guess my sort of question that would be great if you could address is, in the scheme of things, in the scale, how do you calibrate this? When you're a sailor, so is it sort of a little bit, you know, everybody trim their sails a little bit but carry on as you were, or is it everybody back to port? I mean, where in the, how worried and how much of a sense of concern should we all have from these different pronouncements?
Thank you so much, Masood, and thank you for using the sailing analogy, which I'll come to in a second. But I wanted, first of all, to thank the Bretton Woods Committee. You've been always through tough and good times. You've always been of great support to the IMF, and we are certainly very grateful for what you do. You are our brothers in many ways, if I may use this family association. A year ago, when I gave my, as we call it, the curtain raiser speech, which is the sort of the start of the route towards the annual meetings, I used the analogy of the builder, and borrowed from John Fitzgerald Kennedy the phrase, "When the sun is shining, please fix the roof." Now that was a year ago. 6 months ago, at the time of the spring meetings, I said, sun is still shining, and we were forecasting 3.9% growth this year and next. But we see serious clouds on the horizon, and there is a window of opportunity to actually fix the roof. Take it now. We are now 6 months after the spring meetings, and it's not just clouds on the horizon that we see, but some of the clouds have started opening up, and it's a bit more than a drizzle that is on the horizon. So I moved from my roof fixing analogy to, go in the direction of what you said, watch out, which is a sailing analogy of, steer the boat, don't let it drift, and don't let it anchor up, because it's not going to work. And by that I mean, and we all collectively mean, is take the right measures. And right measures is going to be different depending on which country you are, which stage of development you are. But certainly what we are seeing is these clouds out there, financing costs that are getting much higher, particularly for the low-income and developing countries, but also for the emerging market economies, as we are all witnessing at the moment. And all of that against a background of debt, both sovereign and private, that has significantly increased over the last few years. And this clearly is a bit like having more weight on your boat and having a bit more trouble steering it in the direction that you want. So you have, as you said, you have to trim the sail, you have to really steer effectively, decisively, and with political courage. So for some countries it's going to mean make sure that buffers are rebuilt. For others it will be use you floating exchange rate as a shock absorber. And for others it will mean what you have in surplus, well, use it so that the imbalances that we have around are actually addressed and fixed. And we shall see. But certainly after my year ago, when the sun is shining, please fix the roof, we have not seen much by way of roof fixing. We have seen some in some countries, but in many instances, countries have decided to have, as we say in French, manger leur pain blanc, and which is, have the brioche, if you will, and now tough times are coming. So this is really our strong recommendation. As many of you, I'm sure, have seen, our World Economic Outlook has been revised from the 3.9 where it was in April to 3.7 for this year and next. And while we don't want to be overly alarmist and overly pessimistic, we're simply saying that while we had seen an upward trend going forward, we're now seeing a growth that has plateaued and which is going to require real measures while we still have this growth available.
Thank you.
And you will note, Masoud, that I have not mentioned the word trade so far.
So I was going to say to you, Managing Director, that so there are two things that I wanted to kind of come back and follow up on that. One was, so you didn't mention the word trade, and it'd be good to get a sense. I know you have a session later on today, in fact, that you're going to talk about trade, but not everybody will be there, so it'd be good to get that. And the second was a question about emerging markets. So in emerging markets, you see some countries sort of now in difficulty, and some of them are of their own making, some of them are less so. Is this, in your sense, a time when, if you're doing the right things in emerging markets, you should be broadly okay? Or is it a sense that even if you're doing the right things, because the environment is going to be more and more difficult, you should actually be going out of the way to build buffers, to prepare for that? So what's the advice to emerging markets who think they're broadly doing the right thing?
Right. Do you want me to start with trade and sort of very briefly summarize what actually Ernesto, who is with us, will also be participating in the panel discussion. So at least I know that one member of your committee will be actively engaged in those deliberations and I hope proposals about trade. The key lines from my perspective, to keep it very simple, is that over the last decades, trade in the main has been extremely beneficial. Extremely beneficial in order to lift so many people out of poverty, in order to improve productivity, in order to disseminate innovations, in order to, allow a lot of people with relatively low incomes to have the benefit of rather cheap products to consume. And it has been, in a way, the lifeblood of our economies and growth as we have seen it. And it has operated in a framework that was agreed under the GATT arrangements back in 1944, subsequently WTO, a system that is certainly not perfect, but that has given a legal framework and certainty of the relationships that were being developed, the supply chains that were being built, the foreign direct investment that were being proposed. And it's against that very positive background that we are seeing a system that is questioned in terms of its efficiency and in terms of its fairness. Now let's look at both, efficiency and fairness. Efficiency, it is clear, and I think Roberto Azevedo, the head of WTO this morning, said so himself, the system needs to be improved. What we are saying is, if it needs to be fixed, it shouldn't be torn apart and broken, it should be fixed. And there are areas that need fixing within the WTO framework, actually, as is indicated by a paper that was jointly produced by the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. There are provisions in the WTO that actually allow for these measures to be identified, fixed and improved over the course of time. So my second line is, let's fix it together, not separately, but let's fix it rather than break it. Now, second point is this issue, after the issue of efficiency, it's the issue of fairness. And that cuts in two dimensions. The first dimension is the issue of fairness in the bilateral exchanges that operate within that multilateral system. And clearly, this issue of fairness cannot be measured simply by reference to one country as a surplus, another one country as a deficit. It has to do with the rules of the game. Are the rules of the game the same? Are they respected by all players? Are some players taking advantage of it? And so on and so forth. And that's where the fixing needs to be had. Now, the second dimension of fairness, from my perspective, certainly, and from the IMF perspective, is that it has to be beneficial for all. It cannot be about many people taking advantage of trade and some people, because the manufacturing cycles are modified, because the supply chains are broken down, it cannot be about some people just getting a bad deal out of it. So to fix that issue of sort of domestic fairness, if you will, but it's not just domestic, it happens in many regions around a country, or in some region around a country, and it's something that can either be addressed domestically, and I think from, as former finance minister for my country, and looking at what some other countries around the world are trying to put in place, there is a domestic dimension in terms of additional training, helping people relocate, be more mobile, and so on and so forth. And eventually, if none of that is possible because of whatever circumstances, for universal, I'm not going to say universal basic income, because that's another topic that we could have with great pleasure, but at least, sufficient social safety allowed for those people who are, taking a beating out of this unfairness of trade at the domestic level. Question is, who should participate in that? Should it be the private sector? Should it be the public sector? What kind of policies should there be? How much of a partnership should that be? Is there an international dimension to be applied to that? I think those are questions that hopefully we will debate. So that's my bit on trade. You asked me now about the emerging market economies, and you've directed me to those countries that have done all the right things. So I would call them the countries with good solid fundamentals. Right. And to those countries, we're certainly saying, make sure that you continue to apply the discipline that you have demonstrated. Make sure that you protect your fundamentals And if that requires building up your buffers, if that requires revisiting your fiscal policy to make it as growth-friendly as possible, then so be it. But the two things that have emerged from the WEO yesterday, which I think are really interesting for emerging markets and developing economies as well, is that number one, the countries with more flexible exchange rate have experienced smaller output losses as a result of the financial crisis. Well, history doesn't repeat itself, I get that. But I would suppose, and I would submit, that flexible exchange rates are a good shock absorbers to be used by those emerging and developing countries. Second findings is that those monetary policy frameworks that effectively anchor inflation expectations can make the economy more resilient. Again, that's one of the two big findings, well, there are many others, but the two findings from the World Economic Outlook that was presented yesterday.
So maybe we could move from the sort of world economy now to the fund itself. And one of the items on the agenda for this week, for the meetings, is going to be the sort of future financing of the fund, the next quarter reviews. You're kind of starting that conversation in earnest. And there's also a discussion about how much of the firepower of the fund should come from different ways. How much of it comes from the membership in quotas, how much of it comes from various kinds of arrangements to borrow money when needed. And if anybody needed reminding of the need for the fund to have enough firepower, well, only recently, you've had the example where Argentina clearly demonstrated how important it is for the fund to be able to come with adequate amount of financial support when countries are doing the right kinds of things. So perhaps you could give us a little bit your sense of how you see these discussions on financing going forward, and how much you see the financing discussions as being linked to the governance discussion. Because for part of the discussion about quotas is about additional funding, but part of it is also about rebalancing the respective shares of different groups of countries. And in your mind, how do you see these two questions interrelated but different playing out over the next couple of years?
Thank you, Masood. I first look at the demand side, or the potential demand side. What is the likelihood of some countries turning to the IMF and seeking financial support? And to do that, we are trying to really move much more so to risk-based analysis to really understand where countries are, where they're likely to be, depending on the various shocks that can happen. And we share that information with other countries that do that same exercise, and we try to mirror the various scenarios. And it's not complete. By the way, currently we have nearly 40 programs with member countries, okay? And we are in reasonably stable and peaceful time. If things were to deteriorate, it's not out of question that at least 34 countries that are currently potentially vulnerable or at risk would turn to the IMF to seek also some maybe precautionary, but just the standard SBA, for instance. Not unlikely. I'm not betting that they would all come knock on the door at the same time, but it's potential risk. So that's on the demand side. Point number one. Point number two, still on the demand, but with a sort of a special effect about it. I remember back when the financial crisis hit, well, there was a degree of urgency in order to very quickly beef up the finance of the fund at a time when people were talking about maybe scaling it down. I mean, you remember those days because you were a part of the organization. And where it had to be sort of, the quota had to be doubled super quickly, new arrangements to borrow, which were an expedited way to refinance and give it this sort of strong position, had to be largely improvised. And when you study actually the spreads and the response from the markets, you very quickly see that that was actually critically important. So rather than have to wait until the crisis comes about, and that's where I call the special effect, it might be a good idea to have solid resources that can be drawn upon in order to respond to potential demand. So that's on that side. The second aspect of the institution that I look at is what is the current financing position of the institution. And at the moment we are roughly at a potential of about $1 trillion, which is a combination of a little less than half of it in quota, which are long-term, very consequential and solid capital, if you will, and new arrangements to borrow, and bilateral loans that have been granted by about 40 countries of different categories. Now, the beauty of the quotas is that they are permanent. They cannot be withdrawn by member states, contrary to NABs, those new arrangements to borrow, which will come to their maturity in 2022, and contrary to the bilateral loans, which will also fall due and will reach their maturity, in some of them in 2019, some of them in 2020. So when you look at the financial position that we have in terms of capacity to engage with countries in crisis, currently we are here. Great position, in my humble view, at the moment. And I'll come to how we can mix that with other sources of financing. Great position. If I look at 2019, 2020, it goes down one step. And if I look at 2022, it goes down yet another step. And it's not just optics. It's about this special effect that I referred to. It's about the requirement to eventually come in support of many countries. But to give us a signal now that the IMF can go down, and it'll be okay, I think is not a particular good special effect, nor is it probably going to equip the institution with being able to respond to potential demand. So that's why, I'm soon to hit the road in a way to argue that a quota increase, the 15th, is actually necessary, not for the IMF itself, but for the membership. I'm going to add just one thing, because since 2008, one thing has changed. Some of the regional institutions, whether they are the Chiang Mai arrangement here in this region of the world, or the European Stability Mechanism in Europe, those financial institutions of regional nature have grown, are better structured, they have some governance, they can also raise fundings, and they can call on their members to make funding and capital, if you will, available. And how we operate together is an area that we have explored through the European sovereign debt crisis, very often efficiently, when I think of Ireland, when I think of Cyprus, when I think of various countries, laboriously when I think of Greece. And on the Chiang Mai financial arrangement, we are running regular test procedures in order to make sure that we could operate together and smoothly and efficiently.
I want to make sure that we allow these people to raise a couple of questions. So maybe what I'll just say is that I think the point you ended on, which is about working with regional financial arrangements, is clearly one dimension of a whole set of changes that are happening, should happen over the next few years in terms of the international financial system and the sort of the global safety net, and how we can reinforce that. And I want to just kind of do a bit of advanced publicity for the fact that there's this report that Tharman has been leading for the G20 with Mr. Ito, with Jacob Frankel and others part of it, which is looking and coming up with a set of ideas. So I hope that once that report is out, and I believe it's going to be released this Friday, that once that report is out, there'll be an opportunity also to have a discussion around not just the ideas there, but also other ideas in terms of how, apart from simply renewing financing, sort of the fund can most effectively not just be part of, but help to catalyze and bring about some of those changes that are needed in the financial system. So that'll be an opportunity to come to that, definitely.
Yeah, thank you, Masood, for mentioning that, because it's a very interesting and very rich report that has been prepared under the leadership of Tarman. It does not deal, however, with the quota increase. So that's a separate issue, and one that, you know, it is my duty to pursue, I hope with success, because it's, you know, history is not going to wait. Can I just say on this regional financing arrangement, which I'm glad you remind me. Yes, of course, situation has changed. Cooperation hopefully would work well. But 2 points. It has not been tested. And while the Chiang Mai arrangement is probably the one that is the most flexible, the most well oiled and could work in good cooperation, I would say that the European Stability Mechanism is still very tight in terms of mobilization of funding, in terms of special majority and so on and so forth. By the time it's all in place, I just hope that the crisis has not been too deep. And final point, the swap lines that many central banks exchanged between them because there was so much demand for US dollars, would they be available in the same amount, in the same direction? I hope so, because they were tremendously helpful if there was a crisis. But who knows?
Yes, I think it'd be very kind of daring to rely on them being available in the same way just because they were in the past. And I think that's one of the reasons why you need not only the availability, but some assurance of availability, because that's what delivers the confidence that we're looking for. So I want to kind of open it up. We've still got time for a couple of questions or interventions, and I had some people already signaled they wanted to speak. I think, Tarman, you wanted to say something, and then Jacob, anybody else, will take three. One over there, then. Thank you.
Well, I think Christine's 2 points are fundamental, and I would say they are fundamental in ways that are still not fully appreciated. When she spoke about the links between the IMF and the regional financial arrangements, it's not just about bulking up and adding a good number. It's also about adding credibility to the whole system. And as Christine was hinting, not all that we see in what is today called the global financial safety net, not all of the regional arrangements, not all of the bilateral arrangements have been tested and are effective and will be credible in the markets. And I think this is a real win-win opportunity. When the IMF joins up forces with the regional arrangements, we're not just bulking up and achieving scale and impact, we are also adding credibility to the system as a whole. Second, Christine's first point is absolutely fundamental. The core of the system is the IMF and the permanent resources of the IMF, and we'll be fooling ourselves to think that a decentralized system of many different layers is really going to function as a system. The core is critical, and I support entirely what she said. The only reason, by the way, why it's not in our report is that we were specifically told that it was not in our mandate to look at the IMF quota increase, but we have found a way of slipping it in. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarman. I think you don't have to read too far between the lines of your preface to get there. Jacob, I think you were next.
Thank you. I have somewhat of a more general question. You started by saying, let's fix it together, and observing that there has not been much of roof fixing. Now, the roof fixers and those who do not in practice wish to go together are the authorities. The question that I have is, what is missing? Are we supposed to come with better intellectual arguments to bring the authorities to this conviction? I've been around long enough to say that's not where the battlefield is. We can try, but that's not. So the issue is really public opinion. How do we go to the public opinion? Because even in the public opinion, there isn't such a great consensus. See the various elections. So I think, but there is a greater promise over there, and I wonder if you have a reflection on this.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I have one last final question over there. Yep, please.
Thank you. I would like to, Madame, you mentioned the swap lines and the importance of dollar liquidity. And I'm always surprised that the fund is not engaging more precisely on that issue, showing more leadership and ideas when it comes to diversifying the sources of international liquidity, which is the key problem still, and it has never really been addressed in earnest, and I wonder why not. Your new chief economist, she obviously, she is the person to do that, but I wonder from your point of view, why is it that the fund has not engaged intellectually more on what is the fundamental disease, namely that the dollar is the only currency to provide international liquidity? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with your question. First of all, I think that it's wonderful that we have this succession of unbelievably bright and innovative and solid chief economist at the fund. We had, when I was appointed as managing director, Olivier Blanchard was the chief economist at the time. There was no guarantee that it would work between the two of us, but it did, and I think it produced some really interesting and quality work, including an area which is controversial about, capital flows and what we call the institutional view about capital flows. Then came Maurice Obstfeld, who is retiring at the end of the year and who has been also a tremendous source of high caliber intellect and determination to engage and to work with the teams in a very positive and rewarding way. And here comes the woman. And I'm delighted that Gita Gopina is joining us and that she's very much looking forward to it, certainly as much as we at the fund are looking forward to her joining. I have no doubt that the work that has in a way made her a little bit singular and famous, which is this in-depth study of the role of the dollar and how certain policies which are expected to work effectively don't work because exports are just labeled in US dollars, and therefore the impact of depreciation is almost irrelevant in many ways. And that she will pursue those studies and that work. And I think the institution is prepared to have those arguments and to debate and to produce intellectual quality work as we always have, and I hope we'll continue to do. And I would just submit one element which is that there are not many candidates that I can see at the moment that are prepared to become the international currency of reference with the potential responsibilities and liabilities that come with it. It will come probably, and there might be a system where 2, 3 coexist, but we're not seeing much by way of strong appetite for that, which will not stop us from doing the intellectual work, as you said. Jacob, you ask a really fundamental question, to which I don't have the answer, to be honest, because it's a combination of intellectual integrity in the work that we do, but also ability to communicate and to reach out, as you rightly said, to people. Because public opinion has to endorse, embrace, as it is clearly the tribunal in front of which many leaders regard themselves as accountable. I think they're more concerned by today's public opinion than they're concerned about how history will look at them in the future. And I'm not sure that this will turn around quickly given the sort of instantaneous aspect of many of our societies. But being able to communicate clearly without using jargon, being able to reach out to people to what they feel, how they understand things is going to be critical. I was visiting some really interesting financial sort of grassroots operation in order to include people. And I was thinking to myself, we advocate STEM, but STEM has multiple understanding. You don't have to go to do your PhD at MIT to be into STEM. Teaching how, to count, to do bookkeeping, to run a little business, is also about STEM for women who have no financial literacy. So I think we need to really address the multi-dimensions of those who are prepared to understand, as long as we are prepared to talk. That's my, it's a very personal view that I share with you. It's not necessarily IMF deliberations.
Thank you very much, Managing Director. I think we're running out of time. So I just want to say one thing on the last exchange you've just had with Jacob, which is I feel that this is really a fundamental issue, not just for the conversation about the IMF and the work and on the global economy in terms of fixing the roof, but in so many fields now, you find that there is this disconnect between the people who are working within and the majority of people who are outside. And having recently come from having spent many years in the IMF to now looking at a sort of broad range of development issues, I have to say to you, Jacob, that there is a similar disconnect between the people who are working often on the macro issues and the people who are working in other development areas. So you can have a meeting going on in a parallel room here where we're discussing education or health, and where the connections between that conversation and the macro conversation are not being made in ways. So I think we have a job to do, not just in terms of reaching out to sort of what we're calling the broader public, but we actually have a job to do even to break silos within the communities of professionals that are working alongside each other without talking to each other enough. So it's a big issue, perhaps, that we need to think about a whole conversation at some point. But let me, at this point, kind of bring this to a closure by thanking Christine Lagarde for sharing her insights and her time with us in what will be a very busy week, and ask you all to join me in applauding her. Let me turn it over to Randy for the next bit now.
Big seat to fill. Want to make sure I got the name card right here. All right, thank you. Thank you, Managing Director Lagarde. Thank you, Masood, for that opening salvo, and what I think has led us to the next segment, which is a very interesting discussion on modernizing multilateralism. But before we get to that segment, please allow me to share a couple-minute infomercial for the Bretton Woods Committee. Something that's very near and dear, I hope, to all of us when all is said and done, but something we're very excited about. I'm sure you all have it on your calendars, but this group knows that next July is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And out of that Bretton Woods Conference, of course, came what we know today as the IMF, the IBRD, which has now evolved into the World Bank Group, the predecessor to what we're calling the World Trade Organization. And together with all of its features and its flaws and its fits and starts over the decades, the visionary architecture for a rules-based economic system that, for far better than worse, has defined and shaped the economic prospects of participating nations and essentially impacted every global citizen to this date. So as we come upon this historic milestone, there's a lot to question now, and there's a lot of questions in the air. But I think the biggest challenge is how to ensure the system evolves and endures to meet the challenges of the next generation. And we feel that the Bretton Woods Committee is uniquely positioned, incredibly positioned, to at least honor with a nod the accomplishments to the past, but to recognize the flaws in a constructive way, and to push forward the global dialogue needed for transformative change. So that's why I'm proud to announce the official launch of Bretton Woods at 75. You all have a campaign infomercial here in your folder. And this is a global dialogue we'll have over the course of the year to again honor 75 years of economic progress and to revitalize the spirit of Bretton Woods now and for the future. So let me lay out the stage of what this roadmap looks like over the next year, because we hope to be engaging all of you in multiple ways. Hopefully you already participated in our member survey, where we posed forward-looking questions which we'll touch upon today around the key challenges shaping the system itself, the IFIs, and even the role of the Bretton Woods Committee in addressing these challenges. In addition to the survey, we'll present opportunities throughout the year for members and friends to contribute to the historic dialogue in conferences, focus groups, written contributions, and other likely partnerships and events. And there are two other key components of this which will be very visible in the coming months. One of them is a Bretton Woods at 75 compendium. And I'm excited to announce that we've got several compendium authors, essays from 40 to 50 of some of the committee's leading thinkers across the globe on ways and recommendations to drive forward international economic cooperation. We'll be publishing this compendium, not surprisingly, next July at the anniversary, to hopefully a lot of fanfare and press and social media. But we'll be putting together a gala along the way come next October, where I think it'll be an appropriate time to, again, celebrate and reflect on 75 years, but bring forward some of the best and brightest ideas that have come forth over the course of this annual dialogue, over the course of the compendium, and also to help ensure that the committee remains effective in its mission going forward. So we're thoroughly excited to be launching this initiative and anticipate an incredible year of thought leadership and a revitalization of the cooperative spirit and values that would make, I'd say, the delegates of the Bretton Woods Conference quite proud. So if you have any questions, please talk to me, my team, at the reception afterwards. Happy to answer them. Okay, moving on to the next part of our program. It'll be a little bit different and obviously more intimate than in years past. We thought we'd take the opportunity here in Bali to discuss global economic issues and the future of multilateralism. And you notice on your agenda, we've planted some discussion questions. A few are existential in nature, some are policy related, some are more tactical. We hope that might drive your thinking and response in this dialogue. But first, we'll ask some of our colleagues here on this panel to kickstart the conversation with their thoughts and maybe some ideas related to what they're exploring in their essays with our compendium. And then after, I'll turn it over to Emily Slater, our Deputy Director. She'll present a couple of slides, just a couple, on the views of the membership that have come across so far in the survey we've opened up. And then, again, let's have a dialogue together. And if you'd be pleased to share, a minute or two feedback by raising your placard. I can't see the names, but I'll ask that you at least share your name and affiliation, and keep your remarks brief so everyone has a chance to speak that wants to speak. But before we get to the group, let's start with the panel up front here. And you've got bios in your folder as well, so I won't go into great detail. But we're going to start with Ernesto Zedillo, who has to leave a little bit early for another panel, I understand, at 4 o'clock with Managing Director Lagarde on trade. But you all know Ernesto Zedillo is currently a professor at Yale and head of their Center for Globalization, but obviously in his time fighting fires in the Mexico peso crisis and as president of Mexico. We have Takatoshi Ito, who's with us, a leading economist and savant, I guess, on the Japanese economy. Also a member of our Eminent Persons Group, who we have as well as Minister Tharman here. Happy to have you. We have Thierry Dio, the CEO of Meridiam, an infrastructure firm heavily involved with the IFIs that brings together the public and private sector to provide solutions to meet the needs of communities in emerging markets and elsewhere. And Tom Burns from CG, who has spent many years working across several of the international financial institutions, and even before that, the GATT. So with that said, let me start with Ernesto Zedillo. If you can share your opening remarks, and then I'll pass it off to Takuto Shito.
Well, thank you very much. I am very pleased to be part of this session. And allow me to start somehow questioning the premises of the session. When I look at the title, which is Modernizing Multilateralism, somehow I get the feeling that this is business as usual, that we acknowledge that, of course, many things have happened since the Bretton Woods were established. The world is different, everything is different, and therefore our big challenge is to think about the new challenges and how to adapt the institutions to be up to those challenges. Well, I wish that were a real problem. I think we will be misleading ourselves if we didn't recognize that this is not business as usual. I think as we speak, the very fundamental ideas that gave rise to the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions and the rest of the multilateral system, including the United Nations, and all of this happened after a terrible tragedy that cost many millions of lives. Those basic ideas, as we speak, are being questioned. And are being questioned, and I will mention the elephant in the room, by the United States, the real founding father and leader of the creation of those institutions, and perhaps the greatest beneficiary of those institutions. And I am sorry to speak like this, because I wish the situation were quite different, but I only have to go back no more than a few days and read President Trump's speech at the United Nations, and I have to go back a few months back, in which very clear decisions were taken to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, to withdraw from the TPP, to withdraw from UNESCO, to withdraw from the negotiation of the Compact on Migration. And for me, basically, what we are seeing is an overall attack on the very concept of multilateral institutions. So I would say our task really covers two stages. I think we really have to play defense. I think we really have to go to basics to make people understand why having a rules-based international system with good functioning multilateral institutions is not really about international philanthropy, it's not really about international solidarity. It is really about the national interest, particularly of the main stakeholders of that system. So when I put that context into our narrower, however significantly important discussion about the Bretton Woods institution, I think we have to do it in rather different terms, you know, because we were talking before about the IMF, and frankly, I don't know what will happen, and it will happen, by the way. I can bet money on that rather sooner than later, we will be confronting a very difficult situation in the international financial system, particularly as global macroeconomic imbalances are accumulating, particularly as we didn't complete the reforms that were committed after the previous crisis. And then the question is whether the IMF and the other pertinent institutions will have the ammunition and the political will of the countries behind those institutions to deal with the situation. So I wish our job were as simple as envisioning how do we update the IMF, how do we update the WTO, how do we update the World Bank. I have personally been involved in some of those exercises, but frankly, I will consider my own work that I did for the World Bank, that I have done at some point for the WTO, totally irrelevant. I think the problem in front of us is totally different, and I think we need to think about a more complex strategy where probably there is very little to do in the case of the United States, but we have to start thinking about other groupings of countries that may find in a more clear way that it is in their interest to rethink the multilateral institutions. And forgive me to question the premise of your conversation.
Everything's on the table and open. Thank you, Mr. Zedillo. Takutoshi, you've been on the eminent persons group that's been thinking about the architecture of the system, hoping you maybe share a quick summary for those who haven't read the report on the general recommendations, but also your individual perspective on where you see the challenges lie.
Well, starting with the eminent persons group recommendations, we have three parts: finance, development, and governance. And let me focus on the finance part. And we also see a danger of the fragmentation, and but we strongly support the idea of strengthening IMF resources, and in particular that NAB should be maintained. And as there was a discussion between Christine Lagarde and Taman that we did not deal with the quota issue because that was the one limitation, one condition on our mandate. But I think if you read in between lines, I think we strongly support that resources will be replenished in IMF, because that's the only global universal institution. However, I think we also support the ideas of the regional institutions working with the IMF, and that would be supplementing the resources and also infusing some of the ideas coming from the regions. And especially, I think the Asian regions have the increasing weight in global economies, and the thinking, new thinking of the capital flows. Especially the Asia experienced the Asian financial crisis in 1997, 8, and from there, I think Asian countries made huge efforts to, if I borrow the language of Christine Lagarde, the fixing roof. So no Asian countries have accumulated huge fiscal deficits and have very sound, in general, sound macroeconomic policy and also macroprudential policies. Yet that we recognize that there are times that the liquidity shortage may happen, even if you have the roof being fixed. So we do need the global safety net. And how do we build a global safety net? Yes, the Chenma Initiative has the idea that grew out of the Asian financial crisis, the need for the liquidity. And the IMF has been the source of liquidity, but there is a sort of tension between IMF and Asia over the need of the liquidity without conditionality. So large front-loaded assistance without conditionality, that was the sort of Asians' view of fighting the liquidity crisis as opposed to the insolvency crisis. And that is sort of intellectual as well as practical tension among the researchers and so on. We need to strike a balance, I think, between the extreme views on this matter. And I think we have now the institutional view of IMF, which is good, I would say, starting point, or shifting the starting point to in the middle ground. And we have also, different views about institutional views, but I think the majority of us have supported the institutional views, and I think we need to develop more about how to distinguish the liquidity crisis and solvency crisis, and how to tailor-made those safety net to the needed countries, while not causing the moral hazard. So I think the Asian weight is increasing in not only global economies, but also in the governance of the Bretton Woods institutions, and we have to face that reality, and that will pose in the future the transition to more voices from Asia, and I think we have to deal with it.
Thank you very much. Tom Burns, I'll turn to you, and maybe with your background on trade too, would love for you to potentially respond to Ernesto Zedillo's question on with the U.S. Essential attack on multilateralism. Do you see that as an existential threat on our trading system or the WTO, or something that's not to that degree, perhaps?
Thanks, Randy. No, I guess I'd like to begin by thanking Ernesto Zedillo for identifying the elephant in the room, because I agree very much. I think that is the question, and I think we are in a world where tinkering is not going to provide the answers. You pointed out that the Bretton Woods started with the IBRD, the IMF, and the ITO, the International Trade Organization, which many have forgotten about, but there were 3 full institutions. And the ITO was an institution which had a set of principles, a set of rules. It dealt with competition policy, for instance. It dealt with many of the principles that are in fact underlying some of the debate and discussion today. And we know that failed to come into force. It failed to come into force because the United States was concerned that it would interfere with internal processes, and so it never passed Congress. And so the GATT, which was being negotiated in parallel, came into being. The GATT was a contract. It wasn't an institution. It was an agreement among certain countries that were going to reduce tariffs. There was a small staff provided to it to act as a secretariat, but not an institutional staff as we knew with the IMF and the World Bank. I think others have noted in the past that one of the reasons the fund and the bank were able to play the successful role they've played over the years was the fact that they were full institutions, they were staffed with top-rate professionals, and they had resources. They weren't dependent upon annual appropriations from parliaments or congresses. The WTO never had, sorry, the GATT never had that. When the WTO was being negotiated, one of the objectives, I know from the Canadian perspective, but I was involved in that, and it was shared by a number of countries, was to turn the GATT into an institution, to give it a framework, to give it the resources to allow it to act. That attempt failed, in fact. We changed the name. The only part that really, institutional part that really got changed was the dispute settlement process, where there was a framework put into place. And as we see now, that in particular is under assault by the United States. So going back to Ernesto's question, I mean, I think tinkering, as I've been wrestling with this one, I don't see if tinkering is going to resolve that problem. It's part of going back to the President's statement at the United Nations that we will not allow any international bureaucracy to determine what we can or cannot do. It's a rejection of a rules-based system, and I think that question has to be on the table. More generally, I mean, where are we today, stepping back from the institutions on trade? I guess the good news is, certainly if you compare us back from 1945 to today, I mean, tariffs are very, very low. We have successfully reduced most tariffs around the world. The bad news, I think, is one, non-tariff barriers, or other words, conflicting regulatory regimes have become the principal issue. And this is what provokes a lot of political problems at home when they're being addressed. They become very sensitive. They're not very transparent. I think we've oversold the results of trade negotiations. I know in Canada, when we did first the FTA with the United States and then NAFTA, ministers would say to us, how many hundreds of thousands of new jobs are going to be created? We want to sell this. And we in the finance ministry kept saying, no, this isn't about job creation. There will be some job creation, but this is about a stronger and more dynamic economy, and that's what we're trying to achieve. We had a lot of pressure to undertake adjustment programs, and we tried very patiently to explain to ministers that most of the adjustment that occurs is precipitated by competition, which can be domestic competition, productivity changes. There are a lot of factors but we did a lot of studies of what the impact would be in the FTA, which I always recite as an example of how good, in quotation marks, economists can be at predicting the impact of trade agreements. We came to the conclusion that there were two sectors in Canada that would be wiped out by the free trade agreement. And those were the clothing sector and the wine industry. The wine industry in those days, we had a crazy system in Canada. The government subsidized farmers to produce Concord grapes, which make lousy wine. We then had high tariffs on imported wine, subsidized wineries to buy the Concord grapes. Clearly, this is not going to survive. Well, as it turned out, within 3 years, Canadian wine producers had a greater share of the market than they did when the FTA came into effect. They actually adjusted. They started importing some grapes from the United States and became competitive. The other was the clothing sector, where once again, for obvious reasons, we thought this is finished. And within, I think it was 3 or 4 years, about 40% of the suits, men's suits being sold in the United States, were produced in Canada. Once again, I mean, both of these results you could not intuitively have predicted. The studies said that's what's going to happen, and they were wrong. So I cite this only because it's very hard to in which we have to keep explaining, to try and predict who the winners and losers are going to be. Sorry, let me go on. What else has changed? Supply chains. We really don't understand trade flows perhaps as well as we think we did. The WTO and the OECD did a study looking at what are the real trade flows if you take supply chains, imports, re-exports into account. And to give you one example, as you know, the United States has said to China, you know, we have a $100 billion deficit, we want you to immediately reduce that. The result of the OECD WTO study suggested that the deficit, in fact, is about $30 billion. I mean, dramatic difference. So we're not even discussing, we're not even negotiating on the basis of agreed facts. You know, the U.S. has led the trade system, in part because the U.S. was not a big trading nation. I mean, obviously in absolute numbers it was, but even today as a percentage of its GNP, it's only about 12%, its exports. In Canada, it's 35%. What happens with the trading system in many other countries matters a lot more than it does in the United States. A final point on this part, and go back. If labor adjustment is a critical issue in many ways, and we've made trade the target rather than how do we help workers adjust. And to give an example, again, if we look at labor spending by OECD countries, France actually spends about 3% of GDP per year on labor market support. Germany 1.6, Italy 1.8. Canada spends about 0.9%. The United States spends 0.3%. The United States has been lags the entire OECD in terms of support for labor adjustment reform, and that's part of the reason I think that trade's become the bogeyman, in which the current debate is just fostered and expanded a misunderstanding of the dynamics of trade that unfortunately I think we're going to have to live with for a long time. So where do we go from here? And that's where I go back to Ernesto's question. I think I think that there are two things we have to do. One is, in fact, the bigger challenge is on labor market reform in our various countries. And that's a domestic policy agenda item. There may be some things we can do internationally to support that focus, but it comes down to a domestic policy agenda. On the international side, yes, updating the WTO, and it has to be updated in two senses. One, on substance, I mean, there are whole areas like e-commerce, which are not currently included. They were picked up in the TPP. They are picked up in various plurilateral agreements. That needs to be brought together. But also on the institutional side and the governance side, it needs to be addressed and made a real institution. But the question there, as I said earlier, is would the United States be prepared to do that? And so an effort has started. Canada last week hosted a meeting of trade ministers, a select group. The United States was not there because it was not felt that they shared the same principles. But to begin to consider a process of how can we update the WTO. But I think the question remains is even if there can be agreement, is updating going to be sufficient? Let me stop there, Randy.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe 2 votes against modernizing perhaps it's revitalizing, perhaps reviving, but I'm not sure who the patient is on the table necessarily, whether it's the WTO or the US or the system as a whole. But let's turn a little bit to development. We've spoken about finance and trade. And Thierry, you know, how do global actors like the World Bank, the multilateral development banks, new and old, national governments, private sector, how do they come together to meet the vast global infrastructure gap? And how do you see them being revitalized or modernized or whatever it takes to meet the challenges of this next generation?
Thank you. Happy to be with you today. I think I'll start with the positive, which is I probably believe in revitalization.
Can you put your microphone a little closer? Sorry.
Okay, because as private sector global players, I think we don't imagine life without the global financial institutions. Be it because they help policy settings in a way that develop countries. They set the rules in a way that is actually quite pro-business and pro-development for global companies. And so it would be a total disaster to even think that these institutions would actually disappear. So I think we're all in the game, and that dialogue has actually started 2 or 3 years ago already in Davos in terms of engaging public and private sector institutions to really see how we can improve. And the real issue, if you want to focus on infrastructure and others, is the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals, of which resilient infrastructure is a big part of, but also climate change is a big part of. And so we're facing, and again, the intergovernmental report a couple of days ago just showed that we need to accelerate, and it's not too late, so that's a positive. It's not too late to sort of reach that 1.5 or 2%, 2 degree agenda. But clearly, what we see is a very strange paradigm today. We have institutions, IFIs, that have done quite a lot, and I think people tend to ignore that they've been active at all the levels and steps of the chain of production of infrastructure in many countries, from policy to capacity building to equity to debt to monitoring things. But the challenges are greater, and they do require some help from the private sector. So the dialogue has really moved to, you know, how do we mobilize this excess dry powder in the private sector? I chair an association of about 50 members of pension fund and investors globally that manages about 15 trillion. And all of them want to put 2 or 3% of their asset under management in infrastructure and into making an impact towards the SDG, but they can't really find the ways, the projects, the investments. And it's really about, and this is where the MDBs and the IFIs can focus on really helping improving that flow into infrastructure finance. And that again will go through, because all the pieces are necessary, policy discussions, and only MDBs can have policy discussions with governments. Private sector is always a bit more difficult to engage and lecture governments about what they should be doing. The capacity building, which has been identified as one of the biggest obstacles in terms of making bankable, investable projects available for investors to come into. And what has been happening, the MDBs with the private sector have innovated quite a bit in the past few years towards really finding solution to de-risk the investment, in particular in emerging markets and developing economies where regulatory rules actually prevent most Western investors to invest from investing heavily because of capital charges and a lot of complicated regulations. And so de-risking investments has been, and complex investments has been one of the goals of this. I mean, to take one critical example of what the IFC has done with a product they call MCPP. I won't bother telling you what it is. It's actually a very simple first loss piece given to large insurance company to co-lend with IFC across their entire portfolio. And they raise $1 billion, another $1 billion, and in terms of mobilizing private capital. And that's very important. There's also been a number of blending, and there's a great report from the OECD, by the way, on blending finance, which is all about using the minimal public sector and government money to make the maximum impact in terms of mobilization, to be able to make projects feasible, bankable, and affordable, because that's part of also the game. And so I think for that change and modernization to be complete, because today the MDBs are going through a radical change within their organization, which is stop focusing on deployment and start focusing on mobilization. And they actually have a group that is meeting almost every quarter together to actually identify how they measure this and how they're doing. And at the moment, the ratios is pretty much the other way around. It's probably 1 to 10 when it should be 10 to 1 in terms of the private sector being 10 that they mobilize versus the public sector money that they've put there. But there is progress, and they understand the issue. And the great opportunity is this Agenda 2030 around the SDG and climate change. And I do believe that one way to actually show the impact of these MDBs and actually convince their shareholders that they actually need more capital if we're asking them to take more risk. They actually need more capital if we're asking them to do billions to trillions, which is used to be the buzzword 2 years ago. And they do need to be able to measure impact. An impact along the lines of the clear sustainable goals that the UN has set, whether we're talking resilient infrastructure, whether we're talking climate change, whether we're talking about inclusion or economic development. All these things need to be measured in a different way, as Director General Lagarde was saying, in a way that is simple for people to understand, not in a jargon of the usual jargon that MDBs use, but something that is clear and crystal clear to the communities, and therefore the communities will start changing their view on that impact and whether it's being reached, and then the politicians will eventually follow, because that's what politicians tend to do. I'll now stop here.
Thanks, Thierry. Quick note from Takutoshi.
Yes, so just to supplement what Thierry has just mentioned, that in EPG report, G20 EPG report, we have the development section in which that we recommend the securitization of those MDB loans, and also the use of the extensive use of the MIGA on the de-risking the projects with regard to the political risk. So this is again the advertisement of G20 reports. Just 5 seconds on Mr. Burns, that I'm proud of my last name, ITO, and this is going back to 75 years ago. Thank you.
Very well, thank you. So before we open it up to the group, one other appetizer for the discussion, and that's the feedback that several committee members have already provided to us by way of the survey. And Emily Slater, our Deputy Director, is going to just share a couple minutes of the early findings. Emily?
Thanks, Randy, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing some of their initial thoughts on the themes that we'll be talking about over the course of the next year in the Bretton Woods at 75 dialogue. If you haven't already completed the survey, I encourage you to do so. We did send it out to our entire membership. If you need information on how to do that, I'll be happy to provide that to you. The purpose of the survey was to gather perspectives from our broader membership that will inform a chapter of the compendium. And we focused the survey on the same themes that we've been talking about today, the core themes of the global economic architecture, the global economic issues of the future, the Bretton Woods institutions, and also the role of the Bretton Woods Committee. So just before we dive into the results, I just want to provide a bit of context on who the respondents have been thus far. Our response rate was about 10%. And the demographics were predominantly US-based, predominantly male, and predominantly over the age of 60. So we're very much hoping we can get some more perspectives here today, and you can help us represent a broader cross-section of our membership in the final survey results.
Is that a call to action, Emily?
I think so.
Please respond.
So on to the results, and you should have copies of the graphs in front of you. The first slide here, in terms of the Bretton Woods architecture, we asked the respondents whether they agreed that the system would endure for the next generation. And you can see we have pretty broad agreement here. About 87% agreed to some degree that the system would endure. But what's interesting in this response, and what we'll see in the subsequent responses, is that the agreement is fairly muted. The majority of respondents only somewhat agreed with this. So, we do see a not strong and intense agreement here. Okay, apologies in advance for this slide. I don't know if you can see it any better on the paper in front of you, but this is a slide that shows we asked the respondents what they thought would be the most pressing issues of the future across the global economic and financial, global growth and development, and global trade landscapes. You can see in the economic and financial realm that debt sustainability, international monetary system stability, and geopolitical tensions all showed up the strongest. In terms of growth and development, the strongest issues were climate change and the environment, education and skills training, and also illicit economy and corruption showed up pretty strongly there. In terms of trade, probably characterized by a lot of what we've been talking about today, but the strongest showings there were geopolitical tensions and trade wars, globalization and inequality, and protectionism and isolationism. Okay, in terms of the institutions, we asked the respondents whether or not they thought the Bretton Woods institutions were equipped to deal with these challenges. For the IMF, we have some pretty strong agreement again here, about 86% agreed to varying degrees. Again, the muted agreement, the somewhat agree category, shows up the strongest. For the World Bank Group, slightly less agreement overall, about 72% overall, and again, the somewhat agree was the largest response. And then for the WTO, we clearly have more disagreement here than with the other institutions, and you can see that strongly disagree response showed up here, and it didn't show up for any of the other institutions. And then finally, we asked some questions on the role of the Bretton Woods Committee. So we asked our respondents to whether or not they thought our mission was critically important. Very strong agreement here, the strongest that we've seen in any of the questions, which I think is a good thing, that our members believe in our mission. And then we also asked about our mission effectiveness, how effective we are. Pretty strong agreement here, but again, varying degrees of intensity. And we just put this slide up because, as Randy mentioned, and as part of the Bretton Woods at 75 dialogue, as we're thinking about the architecture and the institutions, we also want to think about what the role of the Bretton Woods Committee is going forward and how we need to evolve and adapt ourselves. So that's it. I'll turn it back over to Randy, and we'd like to hear from the group.
Thank you, Emily. So another data point that needs to become richer, as we've said, but perhaps reinforces what maybe everyone is feeling right now in terms of where the system is at, where these institutions may be at, what needs to be done by groups like the Bretton Woods Committee. So now is the point to open it up to you. Want to hear your thoughts or perspectives based upon perhaps some of the questions we laid out, perhaps what our speakers and essay contributors have opined on. Please open your placard so I can see you'd like to be called and share your perspective on where you're feeling these institutions are and where they need to go. Who wants to start? Susanna Cafaro.
I'll break the ice. I understand that there was a total exception in responding to the questionnaire, as I'm not from US, not male, not over 60. And I have a lot to say on this point, because I completely share the concerns by Professor Zedillo and by President Ahmed about the fact that we have this big elephant in the room, which is, will multilateralism is gonna survive at the moment? This is not just because of Trump, it's because of the raising nationalism almost everywhere. And so it's not just the fact of modernizing it, we have to rethink and reimagine and create, recreate, or better create that never existed, a connection between the multilateral institutions and the people. Because in the end, if some politicians are elected, it's because there is a majority of people believing that they need to defend sovereignty, their nation, their identity, and feel scared by global governance. And this is somehow in denial of the fact that most of the challenges we face nowadays are global. And so states are not equipped in any way to solve them. So the real challenge for me is how we can imagine multilateral institutions able to dialogue directly with citizens in some way, to drive legitimacy from citizens, to be accountable to citizens, to include citizens in some possible, maybe completely new ways, maybe through new technologies, new managing of data, I don't know. It's really an open question, and I've been working on it for some years now. And well, I would like to see the Bretton Woods Committee to address more and more these kind of topics, how to involve citizens in multilateral institutions.
Yes, Usman.
Thank you, Ali. Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this, because I think we need to benchmark what we expect these institutions to achieve. Because I'm surprised by the response actually you had on these questions. Because if I look at the international monetary system and I look at persistent large external imbalances, very high exchange rate volatility, I would argue the system is really failing. If it survives, well, it may survive, but then it's just an institutional shell without having any impact. So I think we need to really benchmark what we expect the system to achieve in the first place. And I don't think that's clear, actually. I mean, in theory, the system is meant to induce policies that prevent precisely these external imbalances and high exchange rate volatility. And we are not achieving that because there is no appetite for cooperation, because there is economic divergence, etc. And maybe we need to be more critical, looking at the foundations of what the system wants to achieve and see if the institution in place is still fit to achieve it. Thank you.
Masood.
Thank you. I think it's important that we should distinguish between the Bretton Woods system and the Bretton Woods institutions. Because often when we say Bretton Woods system, we mean the broad liberal system, but we very quickly narrow into the World Bank and the IMF. And it seems to me that if you look back over the last decade, whether it's in trade, where regional trading arrangements have become the norm as opposed to some multilateral framework, whether it's in financing, where there's a growing number of as yet untested regional financing arrangements, whether it's in development, where there is in fact $100 billion of new financing that has been added to the system in the last 10 years in 2 banks that are new, AIIB and the New Development Bank, not to mention a whole range of regional development banks that are coming up. So I think we have to really think through what is the system as a whole, and to what extent should the Bretton Woods Committee be thinking about the multilateral system rather than narrowly focusing on the roles of the World Bank and the IMF, because that's a very much a view that they are the center and everything is sort of around them. But if you go and talk to the heads of the regional development banks, I don't think that's how they see the world, and I think we need to think about what that means.
Well said. One there, and then Jacob Frankel.
Yeah, hi, Paul Schulte from Schulte Research. And we're in the Asian room here, and I want to talk about the elephant in the Asian room and the fact that this is the first time the AIIB even came up. And so the question I have is that what's happening in Asia is, Asia is turning into a seamless, cashless, credit cardless, financial system, via Alipay, Ant, Tencent. And this is, forming an organism that's going to be a funding payment platform for the AIIB, OBI, whatever you want to call it, into 42 countries. And this seems like it's going to happen. And so I have a great fear that we're looking at a bifurcation not just of physical trade, but of digital trade. And so there's such an absence of research on what's going to happen if the U.S. forces some sort of bifurcation in digital trade and forces the world to either choose between 2 systems or forces the world to make 2 systems. Because this is going to be extremely expensive. And are we going to end up with a Huawei Ant system and a Qualcomm, whatever, Amazon, Apple, payment system? And so I really worry that we're going down a road of a bifurcation of a digital economy, which I think will not work. And so this is something I think really merits a lot of attention.
Thank you. I like the fact that it's comments and questions. So this panel should also be interested in sharing any feedback there too. Frank, Jacob, let's hear yours first.
I will depart a little bit from the questionnaire and back into the issue. My first note is we were talking about the elephant in the room, and we just learned that there are more than one elephant. So we are talking really about the elephants in the room, and maybe it's a world in which there are many elephants and the Bretton Woods organization was never, or system was never designed to deal with it. As I look around the table, I think that I'm probably not the youngest one. But I can tell you that in 1984, there was a big conference in New Hampshire at the Bretton Woods Hotel celebrating the 40th anniversary of Bretton Woods. And I had a paper over there and read what was said. And I must say, we are asking almost the same questions, but the answers are changing. And the reason why the answers are changing is because the world is changing. And the reason why we face each time this kind of a dilemma is that we feel that the system must give an answer to the changing world, and therefore, by definition, it will need to be somewhat less rigid and adaptable. Otherwise, it will become obsolete. So, as there are challenges now to globalization, to integration, to openness, and all the rest, is this a new paradigm that we need to protect ourselves from? Or is it a new paradigm that if you can't beat it, join it? Or is it, I have my answer, but or is it an episodic one that reflects the stage of the cycle. It's not an accident that it took the post-Second World War to bring about the conference in Bretton Woods. And it's not an accident that, that the biggest crisis that we have had in the past many years brought about the meetings of the G20 and the like, the most recent crisis, and with it, now the Eminent Persons Group reports and all the rest. So in other words, it takes a crisis to shake the tree. And my question is, therefore, do we design a system that is supposed to protect us or prevent crisis, or do we design the rules of the road for normal life? If it is only for crisis, then it's a little boring, but those are the extremes. Otherwise, it's a way of life, and therefore with less drama and maybe more boring. Let me make one important point, which is the key difference between the environment that tied the world together in 1944-45 and today is the role of capital markets. And the role of capital markets has not been codified within the Bretton Woods organization. The focus was trade, the definition of current accounts, and things of that type. So I think that it is in this regard that the issues that, as we look forward, need to be addressed, and how do we force a longer-term perspective within a system that responds so rapidly to changes, namely creates a shorter-term focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Thierry, do you have a response? And then we'll go over to the other side.
I just wanted to follow up on the engagement with the sort of public and communities. There are a few things that are fixable and a few that are not. I don't know whether you've ever attended any of the World Bank meeting or EIB's meeting with the stakeholders. It's a pretty wishy-washy thing where nothing is really said from either side, and you have a few pressure groups that have their obsessions. But those meetings are quite frequent, actually, almost every 2 months in some of these institutions. But somehow, somewhere, the format doesn't produce what it's supposed to be producing, which is engagement, and I think that is fixable. The second, which I think is fixable, is the poor communication of those institutions. I mean, I can give you an example of Italy, in all places, which was the first beneficiary of the Juncker plan, nearly 50 billion invested in the country over the past 3 years, mobilized through a guarantee from the EU. And yet, the government says the EU is our problem. They're also one of the largest beneficiary of the original members of structural funds. And yet, so what you can't fix is how politicians use a scapegoat, these institutions, as Greece has used the IMF, and that is very difficult to change, but you can change from the institutions the way that they engage and the way that they communicate. And that's why what I was mentioning is if we communicate on real things, impacts, jobs, growth, carbon saving might be a little too complicated, but people do get it. And, access to water, access to health. People understand these things, but they don't understand we mobilize 1 trillion or billions, because I don't know how to count a billion myself, so I wonder how normal people do that are not in the financing world. So it's about turning that communication into something tangible to engage with the people directly, not through their leaders and political leaders. So there's hope.
Hopeful, I like it. Mahesh, thank you for joining us.
Very much. I'm very, very pleased at the discussions and the depth of concern and analysis. I pick up on Jacob Frankel's point, I attended the Bretton Woods Committee's, the Bretton Woods in celebration of the 70th anniversary. You did the 40th. And it is very interesting that when I sat with Francisco Suarez Davila, the son of the former Minister of Finance of Mexico, who attended the Bretton Woods Committee, Bretton Woods meetings in '44. It was he that showed me an agreement that was the draft of the World Bank articles preceding the final. And he was going to make an address. I asked him for a copy of it. I said, may I take a look? I looked at it very quickly, and I did not find in that draft what was put in later, which is the one-to-one gearing, which has been the basis for the rating of the World Bank from the very beginning. It is, and I said to him immediately that this would not have been rated AAA because I was in the rating business. So the reason I bring it up is because I come to the second point that Jacob Frankel raised, which is the capital markets, the great importance of the capital markets in resource availability, resource mobilization, and the transmission of instability, all of those things. And the reason to point to that is that the development institutions have benefited greatly from borrowings, and they become lenders more than guarantors, whereas the original conception of the World Bank group was to do guarantees, not funding. And I think Dr. Ito mentioned securitization and MIGA. And actually, I think if resources are to be used efficiently, if one picks up Madame Lagarde's point of view on efficiency, then the greater role for the development side of the Bretton Woods institution, to me, is as risk mitigators to allow the flow of capital to come from the private sector, much like Mr. Thierry has been talking about in promoting public-private partnerships and the growth of investment in infrastructure as a class of assets, for instance. So the other side is the IMF. The IMF has resource constraints. And there was a thought some years back that the IMF should borrow in the capital markets. I was in the rating business at the time. And I would not have rated them very highly. But I think perhaps things have changed and they could actually raise some resource in the capital markets. So my point simply is that, like you said, it takes a crisis. And we are not facing a crisis. And my view of what's happening in the US as an American is that, naturalized American, is that we are facing a negotiating strategy on the part of Trump. And to some extent, it's real, but to some extent, it's a negotiating strategy. So I just have questions for people to address from the panel: the role of capital markets, the role of the Bretton Woods institutions, especially the development side, in mitigation of risk rather than providing funding, and in being more efficient in use of resources than they have been to date.
One interesting note, I've been reading The Battle of Bretton Woods, an interesting book on the political and economic diplomacy of Keynes and White during those days, and part of his diplomacy was to keep as much out of the articles as he could until the very last second, and so maybe that's why several things weren't inserted until the end. But let's have Takutoshi respond.
Okay, so as Jacob mentioned, that capital flows are not in the thinking of the original Bretton Woods, and during the so-called Bretton Woods regime, up until 1971, all the crises are coming from current accounts deficits. And the Asian crisis of 1997-98 was the first instance of the massive capital flows causing capital flows to the private sector, not to the government, was a source of the problem. And Michel Camdessus rightly characterized it as the first 21st century crisis, also known as the capital account crisis. So capital flows have been a focus of the those crisis prevention and management since the Asian currency crisis, and I will not repeat what I said in earlier intervention. Second, borrowing IMF borrowing from the capital markets. In the eminent persons group, we discussed extensively whether that's possible or not. And I think the one problem which we could not overcome was that where is the equity in IMF, and without equity, it's very difficult to issue bonds, and in the capital markets or to borrow from the market. And we struggled, and you may see it in the between lines that our struggle to think about. So we could not recommend the borrowing from the market, IMF borrowing from the market. Third, this is the last point, that about the second elephant in the room, Asian elephant. This is a very interesting case, that the middle income country becomes the largest GDP country by probably 2030. And IMF Articles of Agreement says the biggest shareholders, quota member, will have their headquarters in that soil. So if you do the governance reform and give the China to be the largest quota in, say, 2031, then we see the headquarters moving to Beijing. That's the future that we are looking forward to. Depends on your perspectives. But we do have some concerns on the bilateral loans that which are provided by China, and that is something that all we have to discuss. So this is not EPG report, but I have another report as a Geneva report number 20, in which that we recommend that China will be invited to be OECD and Paris Club. So they will adhere to those OECD code of the that as a donor, and also the Paris Club for the debt restructuring as a donor, but that's different report. Thank you.
Okay, another comment over here.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Eddie, and I'm the Board of Commissioners of Bank Indonesia Supervisory Board here in Indonesia. I would like to mention that this session is very important and very interesting, especially the explanation from Professor Ito and also from Mr. Randy. I would like to raise three issues about this committee. The first is about the persons, the people. Second is about the system, and the third is about the financial support. As we already know, that Bretton Woods in 1944, which is initiated by two persons, which is very well known, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter, advisor of the British Chancellor for Keynes, and from the Treasury Department, United States of America, Harry Dexter. The initiative in 1944 is to make the world order, especially financial order, and we know in the stage of a little bit diverting from the long run stability now. It is because of the power is concentrated in certain dots now. That's my perception about the world in financial order now. Then in terms of the persons in the committee, maybe in the future, I imagine that if the committee may contain the treasurer from many countries, then it will be very powerful to steer or to influence the world financial order. Second is about the foreign exchange rate system and foreign exchange market, which drive the world economy now is something like a little bit what we call it in a recent development is VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It is something like that. And in 1944, the three committees, which is number one is a committee for in relation to the IMF, second is committee in relation to the IBRD by Harry Dexter, and the third, which is I think closely related to Bretton Woods Committee, as the additional committee to make the other means for international financial order. Then it is, I think, the committee itself now has to have some influence in the open market. If the committee has small influence in the open market, then it would be, a little bit weak for the committee to steer the world order, the world financial order. Then it is very good for the Bretton Woods Committee to have a strong influence by the something like research paper or something like that I mentioned before in relation to the person in the committee from the side of many countries to have a strong influence, to have a strong, beneficial influence to the world financial order. Why? Because if we have power in the committee, then the epicentrum of the disruption of this today's financial order can be, protected by this committee. And the last one, I think it is about, the second one is about the system, and the last one is about the financial support. If the Bretton Woods Committee has a strong financial support from many members of the committee, then it will be very powerful for the Bretton Woods Committee to have influence in the year to come. Thank you very much, and my name is Edi Purnawan from Central Bank of Indonesia, Supervisory Board.
Thank you very much, and we always appreciate lobbying for the committee, and I'll just quickly say that I think the essence of Bretton Woods at 75 is to recognize we're in a very different system now, and the Anglo-American paradigm of 1944 is not the paradigm of this multipolar world, but how can we make this system evolve and endure to meet the needs of all those involved. So that's exactly what we're after, and to the extent that the committee itself continues to globalize its membership and can globalize its leadership, we'll make it a much more credible and stronger voice going forward. So that's the effort of this organization. Thierry, do you have a comment?
I just wanted to come back quickly on the capital market issues, because I mean, if we see it as a potential solution somehow, somewhere, although it was in the mandate of most multilateral institutions to actually promote the development of capital markets, I think that's probably a failure of multilateralism so far, because capital market, with the exceptions of the US and a few others, it's very fragmented. And it's been quite inefficient, actually, and it's one of the obstacles for mobilizing money to solve issues like infrastructure and others, because in most emerging markets, you won't find an efficient capital market where even a government can go raise money in its own currency with enough depth and liquidity, let alone to finance projects that are essential. It's even true in Europe. The commission that is outgoing had it in its initial plan 4 years ago to have a capital market union, standardization, liquidity. We have a single currency, and we can't have a capital market that is efficient. So we're far away from the real efficiency, and we shouldn't be blinded by the fact that the US capital market is efficient, because most of us are not. And it is a very significant obstacle.
Other thoughts, questions, comments? Ted Truman, who walked in the room, and wanted to recognize him as a longtime committee member who's playing an integral role supporting this compendium going forward, which we're very appreciative about.
Well, I just walked in the room, and so I hesitate to say anything since I haven't heard the earlier discussion. But it does strike me from the three interventions that I've heard that the objective of this exercise, to look forward in a very much changed world, not just from where it was in 1944, but where we are today, is something that we all will need and we hope would be useful. I mean, the only challenge we have is, I guess, is how one gets from here to there. And today's world is much more complicated in terms of how we bring about change or establish institutions or reestablish institutions than it was in 1944, where the circumstances were rather simplified and never going to be repeated. So I always worry about if you really had to start over now, could we have ended up with the institutions we have today? But I think that's not to take back from the fact that we have to encourage all these institutions to try to move forward in an important way and move forward, because I work for the Peterson Institute now, and Fred Bergston believes in claims he is the author of what's called the bicycle theory. The bicycle theory is if you don't keep moving forward, you're going to tip over off the bicycle. So you have to keep moving forward, and I think that's certainly the objective of this compendium, and I hope we come up with some useful ideas. If everybody who writes for it has a useful idea, we'll really have hit the sweet spot. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Any other thoughts, comments from the panel or others? Okay. Oh, one more. Sure.
Thank you. Just a follow-up. When we go back to Bretton Woods, and one of the spirit of Bretton Woods, I think, was something very special. And in the closing remarks by Morgenthau, who was the president of the conference, he said there is no conflict between pursuing national interests and international interests, and that somehow got lost. And I think we have to ask ourselves to make that same case again, and I think we're not doing it, and that is why I think we are so vulnerable to be substituted by something else. But the underlying spirit of Bretton Woods was very powerful, and I think that is what we should still aspire to. And I think we should all remember that. That special moment.
Well said. National interests have always been there since the beginning and will still continue to be there. Can we find a system that works for that going forward? I just want to thank our panelists. Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you, Masood and Takatoshi, Tom, Thierry, and also Ernesto. We really value your thought leadership. And again, the purpose of this dialogue was to, again, kickstart a series of dialogues going forward on Bretton Woods at 75. And your contributions through your essays and through your thought leadership going forward will be very important for this. And I want to thank all of you as committee members for being a thoughtful audience, engaging, sharing your perspectives, as we'd expect nothing less. Please join us for a reception afterwards. Look forward to talking with each one of you further about ways we can bring this dialogue to some of the conversations you're having. And thank you again for joining us. Have a fantastic week, the rest of the week in Bali.